Sosteen. Today I'm going to talk about the making of the gown from this portrait of Madame de Pompadour as drawn by Delatour, which is in the Louvre. I actually had the privilege of visiting it back in 2018. What's incredible about this pastel drawing is not just the beauty of it, but the exquisite details. I love that if you look closely, you can see all the different details in the gown, like the fact that the sleeve ruffles are all lined in white silk taffeta. It's such an amazing thing. If you watched my last video about Madame de Pompadour, I remade her teal and pink gown, which is probably her most famous portrait. And this time I decided to remake this, but believe it or not, it was actually kind of by accident. Of note, the fabric was one I already had in my possession, interestingly enough. So as a present to myself about 2 years back when I made partner at my hospital, I decided to go and splurge on a beautiful fabric on what I would call like my dream fabric. It had to be a silk brocade that had a proper 18th century floral design on it without the nightmarish back with the floating threads, because that makes it a lot more fun to work with. Little Bit German set me on a rabbit hole of looking at the different subsidiary brands of the Scalamandre major brand, since it turns out that Scalamandre is the parent company to a lot of different silk places. I ended up collecting a bunch of samples, particularly from a branch of Scalamandre called Tesserini et Chatel. I actually had to use interior design connections to even get a 2-inch sample so that I could feel it. They have a fabric called Pompadour and I just had to get it. But unfortunately, once I actually got the sample, I realized that the fabric was just way too thick and heavy to sew with. It just wasn't the kind of fabric that they would actually make an 18th century garment with. I did find this particular fabric. I ended up buying 12 yards from Designer Fabrics USA. I think it's discontinued. I don't see it anywhere. The best part, it has pink flowers on a white base, which just made it for me emotionally because pink is my favorite color.
Make a pink.
So then I got the fabric and I was honestly rather terrified of cutting into it. So it sat in my sewing room for about 6 months. Now, I don't personally do this or believe in not cutting up precious fabric because, dude, we only live once, and if anyone has a really hard grasp on the fleeting nature of life, it's hospital workers. So I don't do that. However, I gave myself permission to take about half a year to just stare at it and try to get some other projects done first before I touched this dream fabric. Now, please keep in mind that this checklist that I have in mind for the Dream Francaise is my personal checklist. Everyone has a different ideal Francaise, and there's so many different ones out there, so they're all probably historically accurate to some degree. So for mine, it had to have a nice, narrow, and clean watto pleats in the back. Believe it or not, so many Francaises have very thick pleats and others have narrow pleats. They're all totally HA depending on the year, and everyone just had different size pleats. So just look at this huge plethora of different pleats at the Met Museum. They have a collection of Francaises, so you can just scroll through it. Number 2, I wanted it to be nice and tight around the sides and wrinkle-free there, but that's just a matter of good fitting and personal preference. 3, I wanted to have a nice clean waist so that when it flared out, it would have a very clear waistline, which would require a separation of the top and the skirt, which some Francaises have and other extants do not, depending on the year, of course, because early Francaises really don't have that demarcation. 4, I wanted to have very generous folds in the back so that the watto pleats and the silk would kind of fall like a waterfall to the ground. And it would also have some lovely pleats around the side panels. And this skirt fullness is very rich, and not all Francaises have this, but this is what I wanted for mine. 5, I wanted to have a very clear upside down V in the front. Like if you look at my red Francaise, the lines go straight down, which while historically accurate to some Francaises, I didn't really love that. I wanted it to go out in that upside down V in the front. 6, finally, I wanted it to be trimmed to all get out with hand woven trim. While there are many ways to trim a Francaise, I particularly like this design, which I saw in my Kyoto exhibit book, but I'm told is actually located in Europe now. I planned on weaving my own trim, but from past experience, I know that that takes forever. For instance, the red dress, the one with the fly trim that I wove about 36 yards of, it took me about 9 months to weave all of it. So I wanted there to be a good stopping point between making the dress and then trimming it because I wanted to wear it at some point. And that's when I ran across this image of the Madame de Pompadour. sitting in a gorgeous gown in a fabric that I would love to have found in real life. And there it is, untrimmed in the year of 1751 or so. They are not quite sure. But I thought this would make a phenomenal stopover between the fabric sitting in my studio and the finished gown. The interesting thing about this dress is that there aren't even like any robings on it. There's no trim other than the sleeve ruffles. And I thought that was highly unusual, but really, really beautiful. An additional point that I loved about this gown is that the Madame de Pompadour is surrounded by things that she loves and symbols of her power and hobbies. She's holding sheet music because she was a singer and an actress. She has a portfolio at her feet because she also loved doing art and making wood prints. She has a globe and books around her since she's so well educated, and she really did have her finger on the planet. Like, it's such a fantastic pastel piece of her and in all ways. So I thought that this would be a really great way for Lindsay Hinderer, who's my favorite portrait artist, if she could take a photo of me in my stopover white dress before it gets trimmed, with me surrounded by all the things that I love as well and things that I feel represent me. So with that in mind, let's get started on making the dress itself. Before I get started, I would like to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Magellan TV, for helping pay for this fabric. I have been an avid watcher of documentaries for years, especially when I'm on a long portion of either trim weaving or hand sewing. I love having a documentary going on in the background so that there's something interesting that I'm learning or watching. And Magellan TV has so many different documentaries to choose from, with over 3,000 documentaries in their collection. Whether it's about the history of prominent Romans, to the history of medicine, ancient world, science, and sharks. Currently, I'm watching Secrets of Quantum Physics, hosted by Professor Jim Al-Khalidi, and it does a really great job simplifying down quantum physics so that I can really understand it so much better. He's honestly one of my favorite documentary makers because he just really loves science, and he's so good at breaking it down and explaining it in a way that everyone can understand. And you can just feel his love and passion, and that is awesome as also a fellow science lover. But if science isn't your thing, they have a ton more documentaries about art, medicine, musicians, and ancient worlds, and by other prominent documentary makers such as Valdemar Januszczyk and Mary Bird. I can honestly listen to both of them all day long. Magellan is a new type of streaming service run directly by the filmmakers. If you'd like to try it, please go to my description and click on the link to get a full month free trial. Thank you, Magellan, for sponsoring this video and for keeping me company while I sew. Now let's get back to making the francaise. To make this, I made 2 practice francaises. One of them you'll recognize because it's my teal and pink rose francaise. Like, yes, that was a practice one. The other one is the one I released only on Instagram, the mint green and pink Brunswick. After having made both of these, I decided it was enough procrastinating and time to actually cut the fabric. I can't even tell you how many times my soul left my body as I worked on this. Like, every single time I made a cut, I was just like, ah! It was so scary. The old adage calls for measure twice, cut once, but I think I measured about 15 times before I finally cut the fabric for the first time. The nice thing about lampas is that the fabric on the back has a horizontal weave line, so it's very easy to make very straight horizontal cuts because you can literally follow the line with your scissors. And even there, I was terrified. So to make this, I start with the J.P. Ryan robe à la francaise pattern. I find myself going back to this pattern again and again just for the watto pleats in the back. I think it's because, honestly, the pleats of this gown are just my absolute favorite, and they're such a great proportion to my personal back size. And I hear it scales up really well in other sizes, but for me, I just love it because the pleats are really generous so that when you do put them on, they just drape to the ground in this wonderful waterfall, and you can see the distinctness of the pleats. On the other hand, it does take up quite a bit of fabric, so heads up. FYI, while I do go into the making of the robe à la francaise in this video, I don't really go into as much detail as I do in my other francaise videos. So if you would like more details about how to make the francaise itself, I will link the other Madame de Pompadour video at the end.
The first thing I did, which is very typical of 18th century sewing, was to make sure that I had a perfectly fitting lining. I made my lining out of coutil. Then I cut out 2 pieces of fabric for the back pleats. They had to be the length from my neck to the floor plus a 12-inch train, being sure to cut out the same repeat twice. I seamed them in the center, trying to match up the design as perfectly as possible. Then I made the watto pleats using the guide from the J.P. Ryan pattern.
After they were pinned, I moved the pleated back onto the bodice lining I had already made and fitted to my body. Since the lining is already fitted to me perfectly, I know that whatever I sew onto it should also theoretically fit me really well. So I cut the silk to fit the lining and then spent some time putting the tiny stitches to sew the watto pleats down and into the lining all at the same time. I maintain that this is my single favorite part of historical sewing. I sewed these pleats down about 3 inches for each pleat at the top. After too short a time, I was done sewing those pleats. At this point, the skirt is very full already. It's about 110 inches wide since the fabric's 55 inches wide, but I wanted to add some added fullness. So I got 2 pieces of fabric, each about 20 inches wide, and cut the wedges out as described by the American Duchess book. For this portion, I did not use the J.P. Ryan pattern, but the AD book instead, since I did want the top and the bottom to be separate pieces. I then sewed these portions onto the skirt and then pleated them onto the top. It does make for a very full skirt, but I just love the way that this looks, so I was very happy with it. And then I cut out the top of the bodice, ironed the seam allowances, and sewed it onto the lining to cover up the messiness around the waist using a very tiny spaced back stitch. I cut out the sleeves, lined them with a soft linen, and sewed those on using the 18th century method. I turned the silk over twice to hem by hand. Since I didn't want this gorgeous fabric to get damaged from use, I decided to line it with some historically accurate method of sewing on silk onto the lining side. White silk is very traditionally the color that they used, and I used about 3 stitches an inch to sew the silk taffeta all the way around. Please note that I will be replacing this as needed, so that is why I use such a large stitch. To do the sleeve ruffles, I cut out the ruffles as in the fabric as well as the corresponding silk taffeta, and I gave it a very narrow seam allowance of about 1/4 of an inch. I then used my soprano to sew the 2 of these together and then carefully iron the seam allowance before flipping it around and ironed it so that the top of the white was only visible on the inside. I did this with all the sleeve ruffles, or 3 for each arm. While the tops of the bottom 2 were simply serged, for the top layer I turned over the seam allowance and used a hand stitch to fell it down. I then gathered it with 2 rows of gathers using upholstery thread and then sewed them down to the sleeve. Again, I did this for both sleeves. For the stomacher, I made a plain one in white silk taffeta and then decorated with 7 white bows that I had sewn down, with the biggest one on top and the smallest one on the bottom, just like in the portrait. I believe these are called echelles. I did notice that the bottom of these bows hang downwards, kind of covering up the space between the bows. And I really liked that, so I made a point of pulling the bottom bows of the bows down in the same way so they would cover up the top of the next bow. Now it was time for the enjambs. Completely honestly, until now, I feel like I've never had a pair of enjambs that I truly loved, and I've digitized 2 pairs already. They're never quite full enough, so this is where I went a little nutty and spent a lot of time and money just thinking about it. I found the most incredible gold antique lace from To Lace with Love on Etsy and bought 12 yards of it. I ended up using 10 yards, so heads up, this will take a lot of lace. The lace itself is not quite historically accurate, but it's so lovely and loose, but a little darker than I expected. So I ended up using some bleach to lighten it slightly. It never got to as white or crisp in ivory as I wanted, but I still think it matched really well. So while the lace is 7 inches wide, this wasn't quite wide enough as I wanted it to be. I cut a base for it to attach it to out of silk organza. And I picked a silk organza since it's a very stiff fabric and will naturally stick out, which I thought would be really great for enjambs because you want it to kind of splay out. I then hemmed the organza by hand using a tiny 1/4 inch hem and sewing it down. It actually turned out to be 1/8 inch, so I was pretty proud of myself. I then used a zigzag stitch to sew the lace all the way around the enjambe, and I made about 3 of these for each sleeve. I then gathered up the top of the lace enjambes and sewed them to a piece of linen tape that I had literally measured to be the same circumference as my sleeve bottom. I sewed 3 of these to each linen bit using a whip stitch. And there you go! Since these are meant to be removable, I did a very large running stitch to sew it to the bottom of the sleeve. And then the dress was done! Ish. I mean, I'm still going to trim the ever-living life out of it, but that's going to take me a year, if not more. So I might as well stop at this stopover point and really enjoy this moment. I arranged for a photo shoot with my favorite photographer, Lindsay Hinderer, and then from then on, it was all about the shoot. Mallory Harris did my hair and makeup, and of course we had Elise So Grace helping out. And there you go. I confess, while I love the gown and love the portrait, I can't help feeling that this dress is unfinished. I love a fully trimmed francaise. I definitely want to make it trimmed, but that's a problem for a future scene. So thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit subscribe.